Advaita Vedanta defines spiritual liberation as an epistemic correction, a systemic shift in how the mind identifies itself. It is distinct from reaching a physical destination or entering a temporary mystical state of consciousness. This process focuses on the destruction of a false premise regarding human identity. If the initial assumption about who you are is flawed, every subsequent conclusion about your life will be equally distorted. Realization requires distinguishing between two distinct modes of knowing. There is Atma Jnana, the theoretical knowledge of the self found in philosophy. Then there is Atma Bodha, the direct experiential recognition of the self. Accumulating more philosophical theories merely add layers to a conceptual map. Because the goal is to see reality as it is, the only viable mechanism for realization is dismantling the false premises you already hold. Human cognition is built to categorize. From early childhood, our brains are trained to recognize distinct forms, assign them names, and draw hard boundaries around objects and people to navigate the world. While the bias is necessary for physical survival, it creates a blindness towards any continuous formless reality. We become so preoccupied with the shapes of the object that we overlook the substance that composes them. Consider sugar. If you describe the concepts of sweetness to someone who has only ever tasted salt, they will unconsciously use their knowledge of salt to interpret the new information. The conceptual knowledge becomes a barrier to the actual experience. Many seekers approach liberation this way by reading more manuals about the truth without ever tasting it. Relying on the accumulation of concepts ensure continued ignorance, as it replaces direct objectation with mental abstractions. This analytical tool, the tripartite model of reality, allows for a deconstruction of the physical world without falling into nihilism. The first column is Satya. This represents the fundamental, irreducible truth, the underlying reality that remains constant regardless of appearance. The second column is Asatya. This is pure falsehood, a purely imagined projection, like a hallucination that has no basis in the physical world. The third column is Mithya. This refers to a dependent appearance. The observer sees a form but incorrectly assumes it possesses an independent standalone existence. By categorizing the world as Mithya, we acknowledge that while physical forms are experienced, their existence is entirely dependent on a deeper reality. We can apply this logic to the human ego through the relationship between water and bubbles. In this model, the underlying water is Satya. It is the continuous reality that remains water, whether it is still, flowing, or forming a wave. The bubble is Mithya. It is a temporary form that appears in the water, relies on the water for its existence, and eventually returns to the water. A cognitive error occurs when attention focuses exclusively on the boundary of the bubble. By ignoring the water, the observer concludes the bubble is a separate, independent entity. A bubble is never an object added to the water. It is simply a specific temporary arrangement of the water itself. The ego's structural mistake is identical. It claims, I am this individual bubble, failing to recognize that its entire substance is the underlying water. Mistaking a dependent form for an independent reality has immediate psychological consequences, best by the classic rope and snake analogy. An observer walking in the dark sees a rope on the ground, but interprets it as a venomous snake. This triggers an immediate biological reaction. The projected snake creates fear, forcing the observer into a desperate cycle of flight or defense. Throughout the panic, the rope remains unchanged. The observer is not suffering because of reality. They are suffering because of a conditioned misinterpretation of that reality. The ego functions as this projected snake. It is the belief that I am a limited, isolated form occurring within a mind that has overlooked its true nature. This belief in isolation creates a division between self and other. If you are a separate fragment in an indifferent universe, you are inherently vulnerable to change and loss. Psychological bondage is the result of this perceived fragility. Fear, greed, and attachment are simply the survival strategies of an identity that believes it is a separate, vulnerable form. To break this cycle, one must investigate the core assumption of identity by asking, who am I? The methodology of Neti, or not this, functions as a strict exclusionary algorithm. You systematically examine every attribute you claim as yourself. Your name is a label. Your occupation is a social function. Your thoughts are moving objects in the mind. The logic is consistent. If an aspect of your identity can be observed, changed, or lost, it is a dependent form, Mithya. It cannot be the irreducible observer. By stripping away these layers of false identification, you isolate what cannot be removed or denied. True self-knowledge is reached through ruthless subtraction. You eliminate the variables to find the constant. What happens to the physical world once realization or Atma Bodha is achieved? Consider how we perceive the horizon. Even though we know the earth is a sphere, the ground beneath us continues to appear flat. Gaining astronomical knowledge does not warp the physical appearance of the landscape. However, the data used to interpret that appearance has been updated, rendering the illusion of flatness harmless. Similarly, knowing a bubble is water does not make the bubble disappear. The form remains visible, but it is now recognized as an expression of the underlying substance. Realization does not cause the world to vanish. It corrects the meaning of what is being seen. You continue to move through a world of forms, but you no longer mistake them for independent realities. The logic of Advaita Vedanta reveals that the boundary dividing the individual from the absolute never possessed any physical reality. Spiritual striving is often the equivalent of a bubble meditating for decades in the hope of eventually becoming water. The desire to unite with reality is built on the false premise that you are currently separate from it. To seek union is to reinforce the very illusion that causes suffering. Liberation is the cognitive discovery that separation was always absent. It is not the transformation, but the recognition of what has always been true.